Director Lee, the first thing I was going to ask you was perhaps to talk about how you spent your sort of formative years, creative years as an artist, becoming primarily known as a novelist. And you turned to filmmaking, later than some people, in your 40s. And you started as a writer for film, for a film called To the Starry Island, and also were an assistant director on that before you went to direct your own films. Could you talk about that process and why you decided to move from being a novelist to being a filmmaker?
So firstly, I would like to say that I'm very pleased and excited and happy that you're here and we can have this conversation together at the London Film Festival. So you've asked the question of why I've decided to make films instead of continuing to be a novelist. And I don't think I've actually made a decision that I'm going to start making films. I think to explain why I became a film director is a very complicated and long story. But what I think I can say is that when I was in my late 30s and I was approaching 40, when I thought of myself as a novelist and as a person, I think thinking about the path that I was on, I didn't feel like I wanted to continue walking down the same path. In the East, this Chinese philosopher had said, once you turn 40, you can no longer be seduced. And I think for me, it was actually quite the opposite. On the contrary, when I turned 40, I basically started questioning and having thoughts, queries about the path I was on and about my life. And I think for me, I'd felt that I didn't want to continue down this same path, but try a different path. And for me, that was making films.
I'm going to just talk about your first two features together, Green Fish and Peppermint Candy. And both of those films seem to me that the first one, Green Fish, is a sort of loosely a genre film, a gangster film. But it also seems to be very much about a person looking for identity in a sort of a new career. And so it's also about trying to retain some sort of integrity in a world which has become quite unrecognizable, material, and perhaps cruel. Perhaps you could just talk a little about the sort of background, the drivers for Green Fish, first of all. Where did it come from?
So when I made my first film, Green Fish, yes, you can call it a gangster genre film. When I was making that film at the time in 1970 Korea, the Korean film industry, you could say, was really at rock bottom, that people would very openly say wouldn't pay any money to go and watch films, and actually films were very distant from audiences. So in order to make my first film and to make my film debut, to make this possible, I thought that I would have to bring in a very conventional genre format and a frame around it, but add the gangster element so it would be at least entertaining and enjoyable for the audiences. But what I wanted to show in that film, as you'd mentioned, was questions around identity. So as you see, the character who's living in this very traditional sort of countryside farming town goes through mass-scale redevelopment, and it turns into and transforms into this new space, into a city. And I thought that when these spaces changes and transform entirely, that this happened generally across Korea as well. So in the film, the character lives in a place called Ilsan, which is also where I live, where the countryside turning into this new city must also have an impact and raise questions about the people's identity who live in those spaces. And these were the thoughts I had that when I was making the film. And what I really wanted to say in the film was that although it is a gangster genre film, as we said, that the changes that came about in Korean society, regardless of the method of the way, the main driving force really is to promote economic development and increase wealth. And I thought that logic was very similar to gangsters' logic in the way that society was operating, and I wanted to raise questions about that.
Okay. Your next film, Peppermint Candy, seemed to be almost like you were set free because Green Fish had been a success. So you were even more ambitious, and particularly in the way you approach the form of the filmmaking. So the film is kind of told in a backwards fashion, in reverse chronology. And it seems to be dealing with, again, somebody trying to find their sense of identity, but in a very different way. So in Peppermint Candy, the main character has worked for the fascist government before the pro-democracy movement, and then is struggling to find his humanity in the rest of the film as it regresses back in time and deals with some key points in Korean history. So I wonder if you could talk about that transition from a genre film like Greenfish to actually beginning, it seems to me, to finding the voice that we know today. And in fact, the film has some things in common, perhaps, with Burning.
So the time when I was making the film Peppermint Candy was approaching 2000, the new millennium, and everybody, not only in Korea but all over the world, was talking about this new future and this new time that's going to come ahead of us, and talking of the time, this new hope for the future that we don't know yet. And I thought, although the future may be unknown to us, the meaning of the future is unclear to us yet, what we could do is travel back in time, and that was the thought that I had. So honestly, for me, when I think everybody was talking about the new millennium and the new future, what I wanted to do was return to the past. Personally, for me at the time, I was in my 40s, and I was looking at my reflection in the mirror shaving, and I thought to myself, I'm really so old. And I know, thinking back now, that's quite silly, but back then, when I saw my face 20 years ago, it had become the face, when I saw my face back then, the face that I saw was the face that I didn't want to become into 20 years ago. So I thought, I felt this desire for myself to return to my past 20 years of life. That's impossible in reality, but I thought it would be possible in film. And I think films are where you look at things that are not possible in reality, and that's how I came to make Peppermint Candy.
The basic premise, for those of you who don't know Oasis, is it's a woman who is suffering from cerebral palsy, and a relationship she has with a young kind of sort of criminal, low-end criminal who's also got mental illness problems. And it's about how they have a love affair, and society can't quite grasp that such a thing is even possible. So I wanted to ask director Lee about his reason and interest in consistently looking at outsiders in his film. And secondly, to talk about how director Lee got that amazing performance from Moon So-ri. Moon So-ri is a major Korean star. This was her second film with director Lee, and she is unrecognizable in it, I would say.
So I didn't deliberately set out to make a story about outsiders when I started making Oasis. My motivation for making this film is a bit complicated, but to explain, I went to Cannes Film Festival for the first time with my film Peppermint Candy, and I think the atmosphere for me there was very surprising. There was this very glorious sunshine, this very sort of dazzling Mediterranean Sea, and many people around the red carpet, and this very sort of sparkly festival. And I think for me that was a very unfamiliar space. I had this impression that people from all around the world had gathered in order to enjoy film as fantasy, that everybody was enjoying film as a fantasy there. And I thought, what kind of fantasy is my film being experienced as for these people, and what kind of fantasy can I make in film? So I wanted to make a fantasy film in a sense. And I think to get people to ask questions about this, I had to really tell a love story, because that is the most common experience that's intensely subjective and strongest fantasy that ordinary people have. So for the person in love, because it's so subjective, it's experienced as love, but for others it could not be seen as love. From other people's point of view, it could be seen as very unacceptable as being love. And this is why I wanted to tell that story. So in the film, you have this man that's very much abhorred and despised by society, and this woman who's not only disabled, but people don't really want to put their attention on her because of her body movements. And as a result of her cerebral palsy. So I wanted to show the love story between these two characters. And to add one other thing, my older sister has cerebral palsy. Now, although it's much improved, back then, when I was younger, it was incredibly difficult for a disabled, especially female person, to be growing in Korean society with cerebral palsy. And if one family member had this, the entire family had to share the burden. And I'd also had experienced this for myself. So for me in the film, for the protagonist to have cerebral palsy didn't feel to me like it was something or someone special, but actually for me it felt very close and natural to me. And if you, as you mentioned in other films, not just in Oasis, if there's a sense that the characters are outsiders or people who are excluded, that's not really my deliberate intention to convey them, but it's just that people like that are near me in my ordinary life, and I think it's very natural for me to envision them. So prior to Oasis, the actor Moon So-ri had been in Peppermint Candy for the first time as an actor. She made her debut in that film, and with her own sort of very rich and sort of brilliant sort of emotional sensibilities and her passion for acting and film, despite all of that, she didn't get many suggestions for casting afterwards, many opportunities after that. So when the film role came for Oasis, I think given for her to fulfill her own sort of dreams and passions for film, I think she almost seized it as an opportunity or as a challenge that might never come again. And she prepared incredibly hard and diligently. She'd volunteered and befriended people with cerebral palsy. She lived alongside them in order for her to accept it as part of her. And I think for actors, but especially for a female actor, to turn your body into something quite ugly or grotesque, it requires a huge amount of bravery because it goes against your sort of natural instinct, and it's very difficult to go against that. So she'd gotten a camera and practiced herself and practiced filming herself. So what you see on screen here for her is not just that she simply acted well and she worked hard, but I think it really shows something beyond that, where for her to sort of twist her face, her eyes, or her hands in all different directions simultaneously, I think it's something that really requires exceeding the sort of limits of what's humanly possible. So the first time she showed us what she'd filmed herself practicing, showed it to me and other members of staff, and everybody after watching it had descended into this silence, and there was really nothing more we could say or couldn't say anything at the time. It was really shocking to that extent, and there was a certain thrill that I felt watching it, and I saw her really fighting against the limits of her sort of physicality until the very end of filming to maintain that.
I guess that it must have been quite a worry that it couldn't be pulled off. I mean, the film would not work if she hadn't put in that performance.
So it's very hard to explain. This film can be seen as a story about fighting with God, the entity of God or religion. For humans, what this is and what's our relationship with it, and these are the questions I wanted to raise. So when she looks up into the sky, she's sort of thinking in her mind that she's fighting with this entity high up there. So to fight with God is crazy, and to do so, you're seen as a crazy act in itself. But it also means that if you're fighting with God, that you've acknowledged the existence of God. And if you acknowledge and accept the existence of God, you're seen to be quite sane. But if you acknowledge the existence of God and fight with God, you're seen to be crazy. And I thought there was an irony in that. So the film really is about a vulnerable woman fighting with God. It's not a film about God, but about humans and their beliefs about religion and human lives that are full of suffering and what we have to do in order to overcome that suffering.
Okay, thank you. Again, for those of you who haven't seen this film, Poetry is about a grandmother who is looking after her grandson, minding him. She lives with him, or he lives with her, rather. And she's also suffering from sort of early onset dementia. And her grandson has done something, or possibly done something, has done something, which is quite extreme, and she is trying to protect him by buying off people. I don't want to give too much away, but what I did want to talk about with this scene, Director Lee, was it's very economical. It's got virtually no dialogue. I wanted to talk about how you went about planning that scene, and the sort of it seems to me that there's a tremendous amount of confidence that comes from shooting such a sort of pivotal scene in the film so economically. A lot of people would have made more of the police, but for that you're sort of wondering who they are.
So this film, as you mentioned, is a story about a grandmother with beginning onset dementia who keeps forgetting her words one by one, but still attempting to write poetry. And writing poetry can be about living life and trying to find the beauty in the world and life, but also thinking about ethics of living and people suffering and things going wrong in our lives and trying to empathize and resonate with that and the ethics around that. I wanted to look at the relationship between the two, so the former and how you can link that to finding beauty in life. So this is a question for me that's followed me around since I was a teen, writing as a writer and as a film director throughout my life. I think during this process, doing art, looking at the relationship between looking at the pain of reality and the suffering of reality, but also being able to empathize with that and looking at the ethics around that. So even before coming here today, I had to cut across lots of people gathering at the park for the Brexit demonstrations and took the underground here. And there are all these people outside trying to fight against reality and try to change reality and working hard to do so. And there I was going the opposite direction towards them and then coming inside this cinema. And I think at times I felt whether the act of doing art is turning your back on reality and feel a sense of guilt or self-questioning about that towards myself. So for this character, the grandmother Mida, when she's trying to write poetry, it's not only about finding beauty in life and trying to have sort of practice good writing, but being able to look at the paradox of reality, the pain and the suffering, but also the messiness and accepting all of that. So you see in this film here that I don't make it deliberate, that the grandmother is handing over her son to the police. In a way, I've left it blank in order for the audience to feel that themselves. So you can imagine yourself whether the grandmother did report her and grandson to the police for them to take it away. Some audiences felt definitely that is what was happening, whereas other audiences couldn't even imagine the possibility that she would have reported her own grandson, which is very interesting to notice. So for me, I think it was kind of like a moral, ethical play that I was putting on, where the audiences could fill in the blanks and go along making their own ethical choices, and it being a sort of a game, really.
It's very powerful. So how many people here, just put your hands up if you've already seen the film in the festival? Okay, so probably a little more than half. This seems to me in some ways to sort of come back to your earlier films, Peppermint Candy and Greenfish. And I thought when I was watching it, how much of it is a kind of a metaphor for the way young Koreans are living today, in light of a lot of the political, should we say, turmoil since 1987. And I guess I'm thinking specifically of President Roh Tae-woo and what happened to the idealism from his movement. This was the first president of democracy in South Korea who ended up basically being accused and prosecuted for embezzling a huge amount of money.
So yes, it can be seen in that way. So Korean society through the 80s up to the mid-90s was going through a process of fighting for democracy and overturning the military dictatorship that was in place before. And really the biggest purpose at the time was to have this systematized democracy in place and that everyone fought very hard for this, and there was a clear purpose for everybody. But once that had been achieved and afterwards, there wasn't a clear problem that everybody could agree on, that they could all fight together, and in a way I think we'd lost direction. I don't think this is a problem only in Korea, but worldwide. So I think in the past there were very clear problems, whether it was relating to class or other issues, but there was something very clear that you had to fight against. And there was a very firm belief that history is progressing and society is improving, and that's the direction forward. Whereas nowadays, I think there isn't this sense of purpose, or whether there is a sense of that progress is being made and having faith that things are improving. There are definitely problems, but they're hidden and unseen, and it's unclear what it is that you're fighting against. I mentioned a demonstration that I saw earlier today, and people gathering with their placards and fighting for something. But I'm not sure whether there's a real sense that things can really change, and in a way it can become more of a culture of demonstrations. But existing alongside this helplessness that things can't be changed. And I think that, in a sense, the world has become this gigantic mystery that people experience, especially for young people. And talking about the mystery that we have in our lives is the story I wanted to tell via the film Burning.
Okay, thank you very much, Director Lee. Can we take a couple of questions? We're almost running out of time, I'm afraid. But if I could take a question from you, sir, the back, about 4 rows from the back, with your hand up. There's a mic coming to you now. Thank you.
I'm a big fan of your films, and I saw Burning, and I thought it feels a little bit more similar to poetry in terms of the way you've made it. I was wondering if sort of that this sort of formal precision and this greater sense of space and how you're telling the last 2 films is something that you is that something that you're interested in, making your films more spacious, kind of, compared to the earlier ones? Or is that just how it happened to work?
So poetry is a film about finding true beauty. So the grandmother Mija, she goes around her sort of spaces around her, and through her gaze trying to find and seeing true beauty through her eyes. So in a way, the sense of the space, or the feeling of the way that she looks at this space is very important. And when I say beauty, I don't mean something beautiful that everybody agrees is beautiful, but in the way that she experiences and sees it. So I think the feeling of her gaze was very important for that film. And in that respect, the film Burning could be very similar. So the character Jong-soo, he grew up in this house with a barn where they had a cow with his father, who he hated, and he very much didn't like that space and wanted to escape from it since he was young. And he does leave, but for some reason his father is taken away from, and he has to return to the space that he despised in order to feed the cow that's been left behind, and return to the space. And I won't say in too much detail, but he meets this, for those of you who haven't seen the film, but he meets this strange man who says he's going to burn the barn around him. So he's going around the space around him to really see if he's burnt this barn or not. And I think in that sense, yes, you could say that he's looking at this space that he hated very much with a new, fresh pair of eyes, and seeing this very dilapidated or very sort of void space with a different feeling. So in a way, the 2 films are similar in that respect, with the approach to looking at the space and how the characters see that space.
If we could just take probably one more question. Do we have time for 2? 1? If I could take from you in the 3rd row, just on the left, the lady with her hand up.
So I think you're close to Jong-soo rather than Ben. And I feel like the Korean society just joined the group that now we don't have any democracy to pursue, and we have a lot of leisure time. And so, but social class gap is maybe bigger. and young people feel helpless and lost. As a person who went through the 20s and 30s and 40s, what's your wisdom to give those people like Chang-soo who felt lost and helpless? And there are too many Gatsbys.
So I'm not sure if I'm in a position to give advice as just because I'm somebody older. So I think the world that the Korean youth are living in now is not unique to Korea, as I mentioned before, but worldwide, that the world we're living in seems more glamorous and sophisticated and convenient, and in some ways we're truly living in this postmodern era. But inside there are still continuing economic inequalities, socio-political issues that are simply well hidden, and that the youth don't really know what it is that they have to fight against, and it's unclear what the problem is, and collapse into this helplessness. And I think many of the young people today are reflected in the two characters, Jung-soo and Ben, and perhaps worldwide more identified with the character Ben and more familiar with his lifestyle. But I thought that they reflected the duality of the youth today. The problem is that the issues that they're facing aren't their own responsibilities, but inherited from their fathers, whether that's a north-south divide or the character Jung-soo, who has to go back to his hometown and feed the cow in his father's absence and resume his father's responsibilities. So for me, as part of the older generation, to be advising to the younger is incredibly difficult. For me, it's just simply through the film I'm asking and posing this question. I'm also really curious and interested in what the young audience members themselves, after watching the film, have thought about and found in terms of their own answers as a response to the question I ask.
Okay, thank you. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for this afternoon. It just remains for me to say the film is actually being released on the 1st of February from Thunderbird Releasing next year. So tell your friends to come and see it. It's an amazing film. For those of you who've already seen it, you know that. And also just to say thank you to Sei for a fantastic translation. But most of all, thank you to you, Lee Chang-dong. Thank you very much.
Thank you.